AUKUS, an alliance that will guarantee Australia's security for decades to come, propel Australia to the front rank of technology and innovation, and to quote our Prime Minister, is a transformational movement for our nation, our defence force, and our economy. Or is it AUKUS, likely to compound Australia's strategic risks, heighten geopolitical tensions, undermine efforts at nuclear non-proliferation? Will it put Australia at odds with our neighbours? Will it increase the threat of nuclear war? These last comments, by the way, aren't mine. They're from an open letter to the Australian government from a group calling themselves Concerned Academics. AUKUS has become, in Australia at least, a controversial issue, and one that all interested people need to know more about and understand more about. Today, we'll examine the geopolitics of the alliance from British, American, and Australian perspectives. Actually, that's American, British, and Australian perspectives in the order we're going to do it. All three of our speakers, Maria, Siddharth, and Ewan, will join us electronically, sadly not here in person through a combination of illness and the tyranny of distance. Now, this is the first of a number of AUKUS-focused events that we're co-hosting with the AUKUS Forum, an organisation dedicated to spreading understanding of the alliance and ensuring that Australia takes full advantage of it. And we're incredibly lucky to have Michael Sharp, founder of the AUKUS Forum, who I invited to say a few words about the forum in a moment. But we're also lucky to have Helen Brown, former ABC journalist, now Director of Business Asia and Ambassador for the AUKUS Forum, to run the session for us. But first, Michael, over to you.
So much. It's very good to be here. The AUKUS Forum was founded earlier this year. We now have over 5,000 members and subscribers to the work we're doing. We come together on a regular basis across industry and researchers and so much more. You'll hear a lot more about AUKUS Pillar 2. AUKUS is so much more than just making submarines. Having said that, we need a lot more welders here in Australia if we're going to put submarines together. And so this is a challenge. AUKUS is also known as the Forever Partnership. We've heard the Prime Minister say that it's a nation-building effort, larger than the Snowy Scheme, and generations will benefit from the AUKUS Alliance. So there's a whole range of activities that the AUKUS Forum is taking on around Pillar 2 activities. We have world-leading researchers in quantum technologies. We have people now embedded over in Ukraine, Australian industry in the Ukraine around cyber security. So these are things that are happening today. It was a privilege of mine to meet the Ukraine ambassador here in Melbourne just a few months ago. And he said, we love Australian manufacturing. We love the Bushmaster made right here in Victoria. And so these are the opportunities that the AUKUS Alliance will build on, manufacturing, and all those AUKUS Pillar 2 activities, which we'll hear much more about. I'd like to share one example. We have a watch manufacturer in this country. As a matter of fact, they're the only watch manufacturer in Australia, a father and son team. And I said to them, have you thought about finding adjacent markets? When times get tough, we know that Australian manufacturing suffers. If you find an adjacent market, you can have much more work going on for your staff and ride out those humps and hollows. The watch manufacturer now operates in defence and space activities. During COVID, they employed an additional 3 engineers for their small business, which was a big leap for them. And now they work in satellite technologies and making small parts for watches and small parts for space activities. This is the opportunity for Australian industry to find adjacent markets, build relationships across the United States and the United Kingdom, and build our capabilities here in Australia. We're going to see a lot more of that, and it's a pleasure to be with you here tonight. Thank you. Over to you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard, for that kind introduction. And Michael, great to see you coming all the way from Sydney. So thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for attending. Michael spoke about the trade and technical and manufacturing opportunities. That's definitely one part of AUKUS. Of course, the other is the geopolitical strategizing, but also implications of AUKUS, and that's what we're here to discuss tonight. My interest comes from having lived in Indonesia for 4 years as a correspondent and covering many geostrategic summits, including the East Asia Summit, trade summits, so forth and so on. And I saw firsthand some of the political sensitivities that are at play around these political decisions. So I think it's very important to have open conversations about them, to understand them, and to ensure that our regional partners are part of that conversation as well. So we all have different interests in this, and I'm sure that you have some interests as well. We're going to be open for questions later because we'd love to hear from you. It's a big topic, and this is, as Richard said, just the start of a long conversation. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to those online who are joining us too. Fantastic. All right, what we're going to do is have 3 speakers, and they're going to each present the country perspective, so to speak. So to kick off this theme, we're going to hear about what AUKUS means for the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States of America, to give us a bit of a foundation, really, as to what this agreement is all about. We're going to hear from them, we'll ask some questions, and then I said we'll open it up to the room. So please have your questions ready. I'm looking forward to it. For our first guest, I'd like to introduce Maria Rost-Rubley, who's an Associate Professor of International Relations at Monash University. She has expertise in international security, including in nuclear politics, maritime security, and diversity and security studies. She's a non-resident fellow at the Royal Australian Navy Sea Power Centre and is also President of Women in International Security Australia. Now, Maria Rost-Rubley, it's fabulous to have her in the room. Even though she's Australian-based, she's going to talk about the United States, and you will soon hear why. If I could please invite Maria, if you could give us a short presentation. Thank you very much, Maria.
Yes, certainly. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. And I apologize I can't be there in person, but I look forward to comments and questions from the audience. So I want to just give a brief discussion of the costs and benefits of AUKUS from the US perspective. And I'd like to start with the costs, which I think are fewer in number. And if you haven't noticed by now, Helen referred to, why am I doing the US? I'm originally from the US. I worked for the US Department of Defense, now in Australia, and lucky to have dual citizenship. But I definitely, have an understanding of the US perspective on this. One of the biggest downsides or costs to AUKUS for the United States is it's going to require significant reform of domestic legislation, something which hopefully can happen, but there's considerable doubt as to how quickly this can happen. In particular, international trade and arms regulations legislation, ITAR. The comments we heard earlier about how Australian manufacturers can look for opportunities to participate and to innovate. These could be stymied and completely stopped by ITAR. One aspect of ITAR, it's known as export contamination. If a US engineer contributes design input into some sort of defense product, no matter where it originated and no matter how small or insignificant the contribution is, that gives the US government control of the underlying technology. And therefore, that means that innovative companies in Australia, the UK, and elsewhere are going to be really hesitant in participating. And the US knows this, and there's a lot of concerns about this. ITAR cannot just be sort of massaged around the edges. The US State Department has been trying to do so for over 15 years and has made very little progress. So the sense is that it's going to have to just be rewritten, and getting anything rewritten in the US Congress is an issue. Another significant cost from the US perspective is the US has made a commitment to sell Australia 2 or more Virginia-class nuclear submarines. The problem is that the US shipyards can't produce enough nuclear attack subs for their own needs. They've been behind. They're supposed to be producing 1.5 per year, and they can't produce even 1 a year. They also are behind on submarine maintenance. There's a number of reasons that go into this. There's labor shortages, there's part shortages. These are not things that can be quickly fixed. And so if the US is going to fulfill this commitment to Australia, and they're going to need to, because without it, Australia will have the submarine gap, then the US is facing significant costs. Are they somehow going to magically produce more? I'm not sure how that would happen, or are they going to be willing to sell off some assets that they actually need? Now, to quickly pivot to the benefits, and I think the benefits from the US perspective absolutely outweigh the costs. One thing that in the US, it's very hard to get bipartisan agreement on anything. One thing you can is the fact that China poses a threat. The Republicans and Democrats are united in this. And so AUKUS means that Australia, and to a lesser extent the UK, will play an increasingly pivotal role in actively supporting US military operations to contain China. In particular, the Western Australian Naval Base is basically a godsend to the US. This trilateral effort could double the numbers of Allied nuclear submarines west of the international dateline by 2031. And this gives all sorts of advantages, military and strategic advantages to the US. It allows the US to create new attack vectors and targeting problems for Chinese planners. It allows them to power project with long-range cruise missiles. And basically, it makes it gives China a good reason to pause before using force. The fact also that these submarines will be operating as a combined force with Australian submariners embedded on American and British subs also raises the specter of horizontal escalation for Beijing. Because if they attack one of these submarines, it won't just be an attack on a US submarine or an Australian submarine, but essentially attack on 3 countries. So that, again, will increase the risks for Beijing to engage. So when we think about the most often touted benefit to the US about AUKUS is, well, Australia's going to be putting a lot of money into US shipyards. That's true, but I think by far the fact that the US will be getting Australia and the UK to join in and combine forces in this integrated deterrence model is actually quite significant. And I think from the US point of view is probably the biggest benefit of AUKUS. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marie. You've raised some really good points there. We've had lots of interested oohing and ahhing from the audience. So many things that we can talk about later, but I'm wondering, do you have any sense of how the American public views this agreement? Do they even think about it at all? For instance, you said it has bipartisan support, but what about with the American public?
Yes, I mean, the American public is not, from the polling that I have seen, they are generally supportive of the alliance with Australia, and they see this as an outgrowth of the alliance. And the US public is generally, shares the sense that China is a threat. Although, of course, there's always, it's not necessarily, there's definitely some difference of opinion on that. But if we looked at the polling numbers, generally, Americans would agree with that. And so Americans are, in general, supportive of this. They really support the alliance with Australia and with the UK. And so but there's not that much depth of knowledge. But the specific areas of trouble that could play out in terms of with the US, I think they're so technical that they wouldn't really engage the imagination of the American public. So I think the American public will probably be firmly on the side of this, unless, for example, some politician took it, decided to rally against it for some reason and was able to get people upset about it.
Great, thank you very much. We'll be talking again to you very soon. I'd now like to introduce our second guest, Dr. Siddharth Kaushal, a research fellow at the at the RUSI. His research covers the impact of technology on maritime doctrine in the 21st century and the role of sea power in a state's grand strategy. And this is definitely all about grand strategy. Siddharth, could you please kindly give us some of your thoughts about AUKUS?
Of course, and thank you very much for the invitation to this really timely and great event. So what I'd like to discuss is how the UK views AUKUS, both in terms to follow on from the first speaker, some of the opportunities and risks that are perceived over here. But I'd begin by situating AUKUS within the wider Indo-Pacific tilt, which is formed a part of both the UK's recent integrated review and the integrated review refresh, which was published recently. Now, I think the tilt could best be characterized as a form of strategic hedging. Both the review and the refresh are in some ways quite clear about the rank ordering of the UK's priorities within its threat environment. Russia is identified as the most acute threat, and one to which the bulk of the UK's military capabilities are devoted to deterring. For example, despite episodic deployments to the Indo-Pacific, the UK's carrier strike capability remains committed to the NATO Readiness Initiative. China is viewed in somewhat more ambivalent terms as a systemic competitor, and the Indo-Pacific tilt is envisioned as at least from a defense perspective, an economy of force form of engagement in the region that creates optionality for the UK and supports other arms or other levers of government to engage the region. For example, economic engagement through the CPTPP. There is, however, a question about what the long-term future of the tilt is. And there are two versions of this one could envision. The first is the assumptions of the present integrated review remain broadly stable, in which case the rank ordering of the UK's priorities remain roughly the same. And therefore, the tilt remains a way of engaging a geopolitically critical region, but one in which the UK lacks immediate hard power. A second way of viewing this, though, is that the Russian threat in Europe recedes, perhaps not due to a complete collapse of the existing system, but because it becomes progressively weaker, and indeed frontline nations on NATO's eastern flank become progressively more capable, in which case one might see the UK's priorities shift in terms of their rank ordering, a more forward-leaning posture in the Indo-Pacific become seen as more desirable, in which case the tilt might be the first step towards a more full-fledged pivot. And I'd say AUKUS it can be neatly situated within either vision of the future. So as it currently exists, as it's currently viewed within the UK, AUKUS represents three things. Obviously, it represents potentially a defense industrial opportunity, both in terms of the immediate Pillar 1 projects of generating SSNs. The co-development of SSN AUKUS is seen as a way of expanding the UK's own capacity for producing this vital but relatively limited capability in the medium to long term, but also collaboration on Pillar 2 technologies, in particular areas like hypersonics, is seen as an area where complementarities between like-minded and aligned nations can compensate for the advantages that systemic competitors like Beijing enjoy in terms of sheer scale. But more than that, if indeed the UK's immediate defense commitment to the Indo-Pacific remains limited to roughly the scale laid out in the integrated review, so that's 2 offshore patrol vessels and the Littoral Response Group South, then its the primary lever through which the UK can reinforce deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is an indirect one. It's by reinforcing the capacity for action of like-minded nations within the region. And over here, the collaboration with Australia on projects like SSNs, for example, represents an obvious sort of example of how that sort of indirect form of constraining, something that's laid out in the UK's integrated operating concept as well, might be articulated in practical terms. The subsurface domain remains an area of asymmetrical Western advantage in the Indo-Pacific viz the PRC and the PLAN, which are growing ever more credible on the surface domain. And so this might act as proof of concept I think there's a few questions we might want to ask ourselves, though, about where the long term leads us. So we could see AUKUS, for example, become a PESCO plus, as it were, a forum for collaborative defense engagement, perhaps more deeply integrated than PESCO nations within the EU are in terms of things like the sharing of personnel, but fundamentally a way of pooling resource. It could also become a model for a different kind of alliance, one that maybe does not imply direct military commitments, but implies a deeper level of sharing than might typically be seen, something for which, the Five Eyes construct might be a sort of precedent. But it could also, and I think this is where I move to the risks, become either a talk shop or worse. And I think from the UK's perspective, there are two or three major risks that might be viewed. The first question is the long-term relevance of the UK to AUKUS. In many ways, given the Indo-Pacific focus, there's a closer bilateral alignment between there's potentially a closer bilateral alignment between the US and Australia in terms of their threat perceptions in the region. As the previous speaker mentioned, arguably the US has already got the most valuable thing it could get out of this agreement, which is a submarine base that isn't Guam and won't be saturated in the early days of the Pacific War with the missiles of the Strategic Rocket Force. And over the long haul, if Australia is operating the Virginia-class submarine, there is a question of whether a complex project like SSN AUKUS, for example, falls by the wayside. The second question, I think, the UK will probably be considering is the balance of resources, and in particular, where the existence of a shared framework can actually create a pull on scarce available resources across the three nations. And in particular, this applies to human capital. So if one looks at the production of submarines, for example, the UK is operating with a fairly limited amount of human capital in its own industry in this sector, and there is a genuine concern that the needs of the UK and Australia as SSN AUKUS develops may, for example, come into competition, and that might lead to the flight of skilled human capital towards, for example, Australia. The third question is defense industrial integration. So on the one hand, in defense industrial integration across the three nations represents an area where there are obvious returns to scale. The challenge, though, is that in practical and competitive terms, the competitiveness of American industry means that real integration would mean a requirement for the UK to shift from a more or less balanced defense sector to one which produced niche components within what effectively became an American ecosystem, in roughly the same way the US operates with other partners in the Indo-Pacific. This may be a perfectly valid sort of construct, but it is one that differs from the way the UK has approached questions surrounding defense industry in the past. And so if that's the model we're going towards, it's something that would need to be socialized within the system or alternatives formed. So I think the broad perception from the UK is the AUKUS framework offers real opportunities to engage a critical region. It offers an opportunity to pool human capital with like-minded states as well as technological know-how. But there are also some considerable risks, either that the UK becomes relatively marginal within this construct, or the requirements of integration within the framework create demands that perhaps exceed what policymakers would be willing to meet. And so that's the view of the strengths and of the risks and opportunities from this side of the world. And I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Siddharth. And of course, joining us from the United Kingdom, which is very kind of you considering the time zone. If I can reduce it to the United Kingdom as hedging its bets in the region, what strength would America have seen in asking the United Kingdom to come on board? I'm just thinking about the alliance of these three nations, Siddharth. What do you think the conversation was from America particularly, about inviting the United Kingdom to be a part of this or suggesting it?
There's a few possible answers. The one, perhaps, one way the US decision to invite the UK into this framework might be viewed is as a way of internationalizing it and also drawing links between its European and Asian partnerships. And that might be quite important for the US, as, you know, within America's own political discourse, there is a line of reasoning that says the US faces a stark choice between European and Indo-Pacific commitments. So to the extent that bridges can be drawn between the two, where European partners can be seen contributing to Indo-Pacific deterrence, even if not directly, and equally vice versa, you have countries in the Indo-Pacific like South Korea effectively contributing to deterrence on the eastern flank through their defense partnerships with nations like Poland. I think that bridging the two sort of alliance constructs might help resolve some of those internal tensions within the US's own strategic community. But I think the other way you might ask that, frame that question is, it is a question that's perhaps being asked in the UK as well. Was there actually an imperative to invite the UK into this framework, or could it have been done as the US-Australia bilateral? And I think that you've hit on one of the worries in this side of the world, which is that actually it could have been done as bilateral, and we're effectively the odd ones out here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have some more questions for you in a moment. Let's now hear from Dr. Ewan Graham, who is joining us from regional Australia. That's as close as I can give you. Couldn't quite make it to Melbourne, unfortunately, but we're delighted that he's been able to join us online. Dr. Graham, until recently, was based in the Singapore office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He has expertise on Australia's strategic policy, maritime and naval issues in the Asia-Pacific region, the geopolitics of the Korean Peninsula, which is quite worth knowing about, and Japan. He's the author of Australia's Security in China's Shadow. So it's fabulous to have him join us today as well, as you can imagine. Ewan, thank you, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Helen. Good evening from regional Victoria. So let me specify which part of Australia I'm in. Hence the jacket. It's rather chilly here compared to Siddharth up in the basking in the Northern Hemisphere midsummer. But we're better to talk about AUKUS than the southeastern corner of Australia. Although I come third in the speaking order for understandable reasons, this is for an Australian forum principally, and thinking from an Australian perspective. Australia, at a very basic level, it's worth remembering, is the instigator of AUKUS. AUKUS would not have happened if Australia had not lit the fuse. And it's worth digging back into that because the decision arose really out of a position almost of strategic desperation, certainly frustration at the slow level of progress within the previous submarine follow-on program, which was with France. That really was the awkward handmaiden for AUKUS, a bit like the player who's down on roulette 3/4 of the way through the night decides to go for blackjack and instead. It was a gutsy move, but one really born out of quite challenging strategic circumstances, and we see that in the most important document before the announcement of AUKUS from Australian defence policy, which was in 2020, the Australian defence strategic update. So update, as it sounds, being less formalized than a white paper, but the whole point of the need for the update was a realization that Australia's strategic circumstances were slipping, primarily with China's advances in military capability and increasingly open and hostile intentions, including those which Australia felt directly around that time, mainly in the economic space, but certainly I think with read across to the higher end military strategic agenda. that gets to another basic question, that why we're here talking about AUKUS, but AUKUS is a bit like an ink blot. It means very different things to different people. And it's worth maybe interrogating that question. What is it? I mean, is it an alliance, or is it something lesser than that? Is it a capability, defense capability initiative? I've heard different things from different people on that. I happen to think that although it is focused on technology sharing, there is a strategic element to it. And if it was to boil down to one word, it would be balancing, counterbalancing, a sense that the US and its allies in the Western Pacific were losing their edge and lead to China, and there was a need to accelerate the pace of that capability. And that was felt particularly in the Australian case because of the very unhappy and long delayed submarine follow-on program to the conventionally powered Collins boat. So I think Australia stands out as being the one that got the ball rolling. It's also the one most directly affected. Its defence is most directly affected. The capabilities that AUKUS will deliver through Pillar 1 are primarily there to serve for Australia's conventional defence and deterrence, albeit in a rather expanded alliance framework, in which the UK, interestingly, does have a small but significant physical part, with the decision to rotationally deploy UK Royal Navy nuclear-powered submarines to Australia in the early part of the next decade. But there's a tension here, because it gets back again to obviously the United States is the weather-setting big bear. The medium-sized bear is the UK. And Australia is clearly the smallest amongst the three partners in population terms and in terms of human capital. It has the least to offer, frankly, the other two in technological terms. So again, back to this question, what is AUKUS? Well, if judged solely on the question of technology sharing, Australia would be the much poorer party. So what does it have to plus up its offer to the other two partners? One is clearly money. There is a lot of that at stake, with the current government estimate of between 268 and 368 Australian billion dollars devoted to the submarine program throughout its life. That, of course, is not an estimate of the investment that's going into Pillar 2. That's clearly very significant contribution that Australia has committed to making financially. But I think it goes wider than that too. Reciprocity, as Siddharth had mentioned earlier, the gain strategically for the United States is access to forward basing. Basing is a bit of a dirty word in Australian politics. That may not be apparent to an international audience. I think it will be apparent to an Australian audience, but there is a peculiar tension within the Australian approach to the US alliance. On the one hand, it likes to be seen as the most loyal and closest partner of the US that's fought alongside in all of its major conflicts. But on the other hand, rather reluctant to give basing agreements beyond rather limited intelligence sharing arrangements that are currently in place, and it makes it an outlier amongst the Western Pacific allies, certainly compared to Japan, where the bulk of the US military footprint is, and Korea. So this does something to redress that, and Australia is leveraging its strategic geography in a way that has not been apparent since really the Second World War. I mean, Australia has fought alongside the US, but in the last generation, it's been land-based coalition contributions in the Middle East and Afghanistan. That's tended to neglect the importance of Australia in positional terms as a politically reliable, continent-sized, close US ally that's in the right part of the Pacific. And particularly as China builds out its offensive missile capabilities, it's in the right area, not too close, but not too far away, so that it's relevant both in a scenario in which the US needs to disperse its forces from concentrated basing locations in Northeast Asia, but also potentially in a longer conflict scenario where it can build up its reinforcements and push forward, as indeed was the case all the way back in 1942. So I would just suggest that there is that broader context to the way that Australia's role within AUKUS operates, that goes beyond the small size of its population and limited tech capability. Final thing I would just say is that I think Australia, into the bargain, has the highest exposure to risk of opportunity cost and failure from AUKUS. We have had a defence strategic review recently handed down by the Albanese government, and that highlighted that there are significant hard choices to be made in Australian defence capability, that AUKUS, even if it delivers, and there are questions about whether it will deliver on time in the means available, but there are potential downsides to that. There is a parallel mini review of the Royal Australian Navy surface fleet, which has to take account of the fact that AUKUS is going to be eating an increasingly large slice of the defence budget and the naval budget in particular. So will all of those surface ships continue to operate? AUKUS is not a magic bullet solution. Even if Pillar 1 delivers the submarine capabilities as advertised, 8 submarines is a significant enhancement, one that will be attractive to the United States, but it's not a game-changing standalone capability. It's one that will be dependent on other capabilities that Australia continues to operate. So there is that ongoing tension that AUKUS creates opportunity cost, certainly in the upkeep of defence capability within the Navy and across the other services. We've already seen the Army taking a substantial hit in the form of armoured vehicles in the Defence Strategic Review, and failure, of course, would be very significant for Australia. Those submarines are the linchpin of its conventional defence capability. And maybe just a questioning note to end on. Although Australia is going to turbocharge its defence capability with nuclear-powered submarines, they will remain conventionally armed. And there is a logical question to ask about that. To what extent is it viable for Australia to produce a high-end conventionally armed submarine fleet as the pointy end of its deterrence posture against China, which of course has other options, ultimately leading to the nuclear one?
Thank you, Ewan Graham. Very interesting. Just a quick follow-up question. You talked about Australia leveraging its strategic geography. I'm wondering, given that Australia is the nation closest to Southeast Asia, how challenging is it for Australia to reassure its closest neighbours about this alliance?
Well, we've seen that it's challenging in the form of the initial reaction to AUKUS, which was mixed across the region, not entirely negative. Philippines was quick off the bat in applauding it. Singapore sort of held its powder dry, but was quietly supportive. But we had Malaysia and Indonesia expressing public concerns. That, I think, was unavoidable in the nature of the announcement from the top, that it could not be done in a pre-briefed way. It was simply too closely compartmentalized and had to be held secret. We've seen the Australian government trying to adjust for that by doing an all-out pre-briefing and post-briefing effort for all of the countries in ASEAN after the Defence Strategic Review. Some 60 or 80 phone calls to regional senior officials and leaders. That clearly was an attempt by Australia to adjust to the sense that it shouldn't get too far ahead of the region and needed to bring it along in a way that sort of felt more within the comfort zone of ASEAN, which is always preceded, of course, by the principle of consensus. But I think that the trick with Southeast Asia is it's a very diverse region, and it will shake out differently at the country level. Singapore has interestingly been very specific with comments from the defence minister on his most recent visit to Australia, saying that Australia's strategic AUKUS submarines, when they are online, will be welcome to visit Singapore ports. So, I mean, there were no shades of grey or ambivalence around that. I think in Indonesia, we've also seen President Widodo making significant statements saying that he thought both AUKUS and the Quad could be partners of ASEAN. That's a big shift from the initial, much more doubtful position from Jakarta. And I think we've also seen a bit more of forward push from Southeast Asia. But I think fundamentally, Southeast Asia is not in a counterbalancing mindset. It's more in a hedging mindset. So there's going to be some blue water in attitudes towards military capabilities, especially framed in a China context.
Thank you very much. We can take questions from the room now. Oh, fantastic. Yes, I've got a million, but I'll let you go first. And also, panelists, you can direct them to any of the panelists, but panelists, if you would also like to answer the questions, please just let me know. I'm sure we'd all be interested to hear any relevant points you had to make. I think, do we have a mic?
We do.
Oh, wonderful. We have a microphone, and the gentleman there, yes, he raised his hand first, and then the lady with the green jacket. Thank you.
I'm Derek McDougall, University of Melbourne, member of the Institute, and I should say also, although I wasn't involved in drafting the letter, I was a signatory to the open letter that came out recently. So thank you to all the panelists. And we're focusing, there are so many different aspects to AUKUS, and we're focusing on the geopolitical implications, but the big issue is, for me, is, and I'm going along with Paul Keating here, I suppose, although I don't agree with everything he says. Why should Australia sacrifice or further reduce its strategic autonomy? Why are we moving to a forward defence strategy as against the previous Defence of Australia approach, underlying what was planned with the French submarines, and before that, the Collins-class submarines? I'd like to see that point argued. And recently I read a paper from the US Naval Institute.
That will be the question.
Well, I just
No,
want to
thank you. We do have very limited time. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Alistair. I'm guessing that question would be to Dr. Ewan Graham for a start, but the other panelists might like to respond as well. Ewan, did you hear that clearly?
I did, thank you. Happy to take a first crack at it. I mean, I think on the different framing of forward defence and Defence of Australia, I think Defence of Australia still has its adherence in the debate, but it's increasingly difficult, I think, to intellectually underpin it, because Australia, although it is continent, it has the continental sized resource allocation, it exists within a global system, always has done, doesn't have significant scale in population terms to sustain itself, even under a kind of prickly porcupine defense strategy. I think if it got to that stage, Australia would already be a strategic price taker. Australia does also depend on maritime enforcement from the United States and other sources. So I think without wanting to commit to forward defence redux, I think the sense is that the counterbalancing that needs to be done has to be done in coordination with like-minded countries. That's the basic logic underpinning the Quad. Although the Quad has moved away from a military agenda, I think it does still owe its existence fundamentally to a counterbalancing logic. Australia realises that it doesn't have the heft to deter alone. And AUKUS is a doubling down on old partners. I think that gets a bit of a rough ride from certain sections in the Australian debate who see the UK and Australia as, you know, a vote for yesteryear's Anglophone partners. But I think that also needs a bit of interrogation, because we're talking at the very high level of particularly nuclear propulsion. There are very few countries that are able to cooperate at that high level of secrecy. And of course, the UK, Australia, and the United States are already part of the Five Eyes framework, which is not about defense cooperation, but it certainly does deal with high compartmentalized secret cooperation. I think Anglophone countries are useful. AUKUS plays its role, but if you look at Australian foreign policy, it's not about doubling down only on the UK and Australia. It's about putting Southeast Asia first. That's what Penny Wong has said, and I think she's committed to that in the number of countries that she's visited, the Pacific too. So I think the sense that Australia needs to swim and carry its water in Asia is not inconsistent with AUKUS.
Thank you.
I'd love to just jump in for a moment. So I was giving the perspective of the United States. If I were giving the perspective of Australia, you know, I do think it's quite a big concern. And I agree with Ewan when he says, if you want to counterbalance, you need to do it with other countries. And the concern that a number of experts have expressed, myself included, is that Australia is very clearly the junior partner. I'd agree with Ewan that most of the risks are being borne by Australia. Whereas the US tends to be reaping a lot of the benefits. And one thing I'd like to put out is that a lot of the risks relate to some of the risks relate to US domestic politics, that Australia is putting a lot of eggs in you know, the basket of the Virginia class submarines to make sure we don't have a submarine gap. And that is really dependent on a lot going on within the US domestic context, which is not a reliable context. I mean, things are happening in the US domestic politically that are simply shocking to Australians. And so I think there are a lot of questions here that Australians should be thinking about.
Thank you. And Siddharth, would you like to add, or?
Just a couple of minor points. So I suppose on the shift to forward defense, just building off what was said by previous speakers, Ewan in particular, if the linchpin of Australia's security is partnerships, and those partnerships exist forward, and obviously the primary one will be the link to the US, then in some ways it becomes a sine qua non, because ultimately what happens forward in the first island chain will determine the future of the US posture in Asia, and that in turn will determine the future of Australia's security environment. So there almost becomes no alternative to forward defense short of a fundamental rethinking of one's own security relationships. But that's a fairly minor point that I'd add to what the other two speakers have made.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. We'll go to our next question.
Is that on? Zara Kimpton, National Vice President of AAA. So my question, actually, Maria was starting to address that in her last response. What will happen when you talked about the ITAR legislation and things needing changes if Donald Trump is elected the next president of the United States? How do you see, how will this affect AUKUS?
Thank you.
Well, look, we don't know what will happen. I mean, there are significant risks here. We do know there's bipartisan support in Congress for this agreement to go ahead. Changing legislation is always very difficult. You know, different, parties want to put in, their own spin, which can make it very difficult, especially in an extremely polarized environment that we have in the United States right now. And so if we have Donald Trump elected president, it's very hard to know what will happen. And I'm not an alarmist, but when he posts things on his social media account that say we should think about suspending the US Constitution, all bets are off here. It's a little hard to see how you can move forward with the rewrite of major legislation when you have things like that happening. Now, look, my guess is that Trump won't be elected. Of course, I could absolutely be wrong, but even other, Republicans elected, there are concerns. Remember that Ron DeSantis, who's one of the front runners as well on the Republican side, had said that Ukraine was just a sort of territorial issue between Russia and Ukraine, or that the Ukraine issue was just a territorial issue. And of course, the same thing could be said about Taiwan, from the Chinese perspective. And so, a lot of things are being said and done on the Republican side that make it hard to predict. And I think Australians don't understand just how volatile and polarized the situation is in the United States.
Okay. I think this audience does, I get a sense. They're well versed. Thank you, Maria. We have another question.
Thank you. My question is to Maria and Ewan, but I wouldn't mind the UK representative to reflect as well, if possible. Maria, you actually listed some constraints, but when one looks at it, they sound more like, sorry, so you listed them as costs to America, but to me, they sound like constraints that Australia has to think very carefully about. They're not really costs to the US, they're constraints in my mind. And has anyone looked at the benefits of the dollar expression of the benefit of the Western Australia base for the US, as well as the knowledge base of Australia in the Southeast or in the South Pacific region to the US? Because we hardly ever hear about that. So that adds to our costs.
Well, I agree with you that these are constraints for Australia, but they're constraints for Australia because cost to the US could cause the deal to stumble, and therefore Australia has to pay very close attention to them. I do think they are true costs for the US. I mean, rewriting domestic legislation in a polarized environment like this is going to be very difficult. It's going to be costly for parties, for whether it's Biden again, or depending on who the Republican, if the Republican president wins. And certainly it's a significant cost to the US in terms of its nuclear attack submarine capability. And, defense has said we, are expecting to be at this level, and they're not. And so to sell, at least 2 of their Virginia class is a cost for defense policymakers in terms of their strategy, in terms of their planning. But you are right that they are also issues that should put Australia on alert and think about seriously, because if these things cause the US to backpedal at all, then Australia is the one that ultimately will pay the price.
Ewan Graham?
Yeah, just to add what Maria had said, I mean, I think it's right that the US is seen, I think, as having come out pretty well from the submarine announcement. Pillar 2, we haven't talked about. Maybe there'll be a question about that later. But there is obviously some caution on the US side, and bureaucratic inertia probably more the overriding factor on technology transfer. But because Australia's resources are limited, I think that is a contingent cost on the United States. If the AUKUS SSN project gets significantly delayed due to UK capacity constraints as well as Australian capacity constraints, who's going to be the one who has to bail out? It'll be the US. I mean, I think that is the reality. Is the US as the bigger partner will ultimately, face a risk that it has to lean in. And as Maria has aptly said, just to sort of turn the Australian debate on its head, Australia gets concerned about the Paul Keating question about losing strategic autonomy, but the US is handing over submarines that will be out of its chain of command. I mean, although Australia is a close ally of America, those assets will not be controlled. The government has been very clear from Canberra that that command and control will be a sovereign decision in Australian hands. That doesn't mean Australia going it alone. It's more likely that it's going to be in coalition. And in broad historical sweep, Australia has never fought alone. That is a very significant fact. But I think that is still going to be seen as a big major potential downside on the US Navy side, given the capacity constraints that they are going to reach their nadir in submarine capability towards the end of this decade, at precisely the moment when strategic question may be asked by its most likely adversary, China.
Siddharth, did you want to add?
Yeah, so I might, on the question of submarine capacity, I'd actually strike a slightly contrarian note, which is, I don't think this will necessarily, it could strain American SSN capacity, but it need not necessarily do so. And that's because the single biggest drag on American SSN availability is actually not the build rate, it's the maintenance backlogs they have. Currently, they have 18 submarines awaiting maintenance in their shipyards, about twice what they should. And that's largely a reflection of the fact that shipyards don't stock spares to the extent they do. They stock about 50% of what they need and they buy the rest on a needs must basis. Now, if where the Australian investment in America's shipbuilding capacity goes is towards that maintenance backlog, the net effect on America's SSN availability, even when you factor in the loss of 2 submarines through sale, could actually be an increase rather than a decrease. So none of that is to dismiss what the other 2 speakers have said. That's a real possibility, but it's not a necessary outcome, would be the one point I'd make. The second thing is, it's interesting, when you look at the Cold War, the amount of domestic upheaval you see in American foreign policy, but the one thing that stays constant is containment towards the USSR. And in some ways, the very polarization makes it that, domestically makes it that way. No one wants to be accused of being soft on the Soviets by their opponents. So actually, it almost forces a consensus. I see China becoming a similar sort of issue with the US. There's a debate about Ukraine between the Republicans and the Democrats, not purely, but to be crude in sort of dividing the political lines, largely because opponents of support of open-ended support to Ukraine see it as a peripheral theater that's a distraction from China. But almost everybody, whatever their position, seems to agree on the Indo-Pacific as a critical area for American commitment. So I almost feel, no matter how volatile American politics gets in the next few years, the Indo-Pacific and within that context, frameworks like AUKUS will probably prove some of the most durable elements of American foreign policy.
Thank you all for your contributions. That was a fantastic answer. Oh, unfortunately, that's a shame. We can't sneak in one more, Alistair. Would everyone like to hear one more? One more. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So my question is on the more elusive Pillar 2 and its promises to address Australia's defence technology capability gap across advanced technologies. We quite obviously speak of Pillar 1 quite often because it's very material and it makes a lot of good chat and good debate. But how about Pillar 2 in the context of cyber threats and new wars and everything else that we're facing in the region and broader?
Yeah. Good question. Thank you. Thank you, Alistair. Let's start, Siddharth, with you, and then I'll go to Maria and then Ewan, because this is actually a critical part of AUKUS.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Pillar 2 will be a critical component of how AUKUS develops. Certainly, Australia is not necessarily a net. It's a net contributor in many of these areas. Hypersonics, for example, represents an area where, through programs like Skyfire, Australia and the US have collaborated and perhaps developed capability to a degree that the UK has not. And so, we over here, we'd probably see ourselves being net beneficiaries in that particular area. I think the broad question that should frame Pillar 2 is where asymmetrical competitive advantage can be found, because with the PRC ones looking at a competitor that actually is a behemoth in science and technology terms, has, produces more highly cited research in many fields than the US does now. And so assuming one can achieve competitive overmatch across the board, like we did towards the end of the Cold War, where in 15 out of 20 technologies the DoD deemed militarily critical, it assessed the US to be, comfortably ahead of the Soviets. I don't think we're ever going to get there with China. So I think deciding what really counts will be critical to determining the success of Pillar 2, rather than making it a sort of one-stop shop for technological development across the board.
Thank you. Maria? Just briefly too, please, Maria, sorry.
Yes. So look, Pillar 2 is really important. It's what we know very little about. And so it's hard to give definitive comments. My perspective in terms of from the US perspective is, again, ITAR has the potential to really delay and to discourage innovators in Australia and in the UK from participating. And in fact, one has posed the question, does Washington just want us to fight, or are we allowed to innovate as well? And so I think a lot hangs on the balance of whether or not Congress is able to refashion this so that innovators don't find suddenly their intellectual property being owned by the US government.
Thank you. And Ewan, finally, thank you.
Very quickly, but to amplify what Maria's caveat, we have to be very careful on the outside of what is an extremely secret and compartmentalized business, making judgments that may or may not hold water. My sense, for what it's worth, is that Pillar 2 it was appropriately left until the submarine decision had all of the effort went into the submarine decision, because that's where it needed to be, and probably frankly still does need to be for some time. This is, I think, a very much a sort of second order level of priority. Everyone wants their sort of pet project in this space, so that I think that the debate may not necessarily track the reality. My hunch is that the UK is somewhat less invested in Pillar 2 than the other two, so it may be that it ends up being bilateralized. There's a lot of Australian effort to make sure that the bureaucratic and congressional emollient is in place that will allow the technology to flow to Australia, but it will be largely, I think, a one-way trade. There are areas where Australia can contribute. Quantum sensing is another, but in scale terms, clearly this is not an alliance of equals, although it is between between sovereign partners.
Thank you. Fantastic responses and lots of questions raised. Obviously a complex issue, and we thank everyone for their time this evening, for your questions, for your interest, and could you please thank our panelists. Thank you.